As practically any job interview skills workshop will tell you, first impressions are the most important. If you don't make it a good one, chances are you're not really going to achieve what you set out to do, and if that goal is entertaining people, well, you've got one hell of an uphill battle ahead of you. Naturally, the majority of video games have studied and mastered the ancient art of the first impression over the past decades, whether it be through easing the player in with a nice and manageable difficulty curve, throwing some spectacular set pieces at you, or just by giving you a taste of what's to come further down the road. Keep in mind, as I said, most and not all video games, because naturally we find an exception to this, a deviation from the standard, if you will, and not in a good way. Games that instead open up with a level that looks like it was either created by complete morons or was simply thrown together in a couple of hours. This then creates a knock-on effect as people then question their reasons for buying your product and wonder if they should keep playing, which from a business standpoint isn't really something you want. Question: is it wrong to go for the low-hanging fruit? In certain cases, probably, but for this video I've decided, fuck it, I'm doing it anyway. So, Starhawk. I get this primarily a multiplayer game and the single player is basically just training for the multiplayer, but could you maybe just put a tad more effort into it, please? Chapter 1 of Starhawk's single player campaign is probably one of the most barren and repetitive levels I played, which ironically means it fits with the rest of the campaign and its stupidly slow pacing, but that's a rant for another time. Sure, Starhawk's primarily based on and around this cliche desert planet, but you could have maybe put a tad more effort into the visuals. Or don't. That works too, I guess. Pretty much every route in this level feels the exact same, and I found myself getting lost and going back to the place I've just left time and time again. As for the combat sections, they're nothing too mind-blowing, just the same bog-standard third-person shooter combat we've seen since the mid-2000s, and it's topped off with one of those painfully long build and battle segments that was this game's claim to fame. While later levels do have similar issues with the length of these sections, at least they gave you stuff to do. This one hardly has anything attack you aside from a few basic mooks, and that's the climax. No gradual progression difficulty, just kill about a dozen goons and you're done. Joy. At least it sets you with the rest of the game. Who knew a 6-hour campaign could feel so long? As I've stated before, like in the previous entry, bad pacing is what kills my enjoyment of a lot of things. It doesn't matter how well you've crafted a level from a gameplay standpoint, if you fuck up the storytelling, it honestly loses my interest faster than that of the 2015 Fantastic Four movie. Unfortunately, this means we arrive at the prologue chapter of Okami. Now, don't get me wrong, Okami is a pretty good game at the end of the day. Only downside is I have to wade through the incredibly slow-paced prologue chapter in order to experience the rest of it. From a gameplay perspective, Okami's prologue isn't half bad. It teaches you how to play this quirky little action platformer, what the celestial brush is and how to use it, and it gives you a fairly decent introduction to this colourful world. Problem is, this area is very, now what's the phrase here, stop-start. By that I mean that the ratio of gameplay to cutscenes and exposition is heavily balanced in favour of the latter. Not quite to the levels of something like, say, Metal Gear Solid 4, a game infamous for its amount of cutscenes, but it can get very tedious in places. It feels like the moment I'm getting into some sort of rhythm, the whole thing grinds to a halt in the most spectacular way possible, forcing you to sit through another bit of dialogue that explains something or other that's mildly important in some way, shape or form. Granted, the vast majority of these are in fact skippable by mashing the X button like your life depended on it, but this does help eliminate some of the frustration of subsequent playthroughs, but for those first time players, it's not really the fun experience that we were all expecting. So, yeah, at this point highlighting the many negatives of Sonic 06 isn't exactly beating a dead horse. By now, that horse's carcass has turned to dust, so all you're really doing is hitting the ground with a stick. I went into Sonic 06 an open mind. After all, people tend to over-exaggerate both the positive and negative qualities of things all the time. Can't be all that bad, right? Oh, God, was I wrong. I know that technically there's stripping levels to pick from here depending on which story you play through, but seeing as you're straight required to play through Sonic's story first, it's Wave Ocean that's on the chopping block for today. Hooray! Honestly, this level might actually be the least broken part of the game, although considering that said game is the bug run in Sonic 06, that's not saying much. I see what they were trying to do here, which is recapture the spirit of the opening of Sonic Adventure, and yeah, I can see the comparisons. Heck, that whole bit where you run away from the whale is lifted straight from that game, wonky camera and all. However, saying they failed would be a colossal understatement. There's a lot of wonky physics on the water running in stone loops. I've come to a dead stop while upside down and not fallen, hit a speed boost slightly off center and then flying to the left, even just straight up clipped through the water to my death on more than one occasion. I suppose, yes, the glitches do add to the bizarre charm that 06 has, but take them out of the equation and what we're left with is a barren and confusing mess of a level. We've had multiple pathways in Sonic games before, but this is kind of overkill. The section where you play as Tails in particular basically has you doing this while fighting the bad controls and with no directions where you're supposed to go, leading to you just blindly stumbling around hoping you get lucky. Then the level gets topped off with one of the infamous max speed sections which control like crap. I suppose it can be possible to do this without getting hit. Yes, Jimmy, I see you raising your hand. No, you're not special. But good luck trying to navigate this crap fest without hitting something. You're basically relying on trial and error for the most part, and honestly, that's not a quality you want for your opening act. Resistance Fall of Man is one of those weird early PS3 games that not many people tend to talk about, yet was somehow successful enough to spawn a sequel or two. It's not half bad all things considered, could use a few tune-ups in places, and admittedly I've played better shooters, but for what it is, it's pretty solid. Set in an alternate timeline where World War II never happened, but Earth was instead invaded by the Chimera aliens, Resistance follows the story of Nathan Hale, the sole survivor of an American expeditionary force sent to assist the British as they struggle to defend their homeland from the Chimera. Naturally, the first level of the game takes place during the initial assault by the Americans, and naturally it doesn't really go so well for them. From a simple level structure and design standpoint, this level in York isn't all that bad. There's decent cover, the layout is straightforward, and the number of enemies is pretty manageable. However, there are two glaring issues that make this level aggravating to play through. The first is that your primary weapon, the carbine, is ridiculously underpowered when it comes to fighting the standard Chimera enemies. It's not quite to the level of the Lancer from Gears of War, but it's still noticeable when it takes about 10 or so shots to kill them. This makes fighting large groups of them insanely tedious, as they take forever and a day to go down. The other big problem is slightly more frustrating to deal with, and it requires a bit of explaining, so bear with me. Instead of using the regenerating health system, Resistance instead uses a health bar which was commonplace for shooters at the time. Unfortunately, developers at Insomniac decided to have the brilliant idea of not including any health pickups in the opening section at all, and checkpoints don't restore your full health upon respawning. Instead, they revive at the health level you were at when you activated them. You can already see the problem here, right? Combine that with the previously mentioned immaturability, and more often than not, you'll hit a checkpoint, get killed and respawn, only to immediately die again due to having hardly any health, which means you're left with one hell of a mountain to climb right at the start. Anyone up for another painfully tedious opening level? Yeah, on reflection, Metal Gear Solid 5 wasn't exactly the masterpiece people thought it was upon release. Don't get me wrong, it's still a pretty impressive and thoroughly enjoyable experience, but there are quite a few stumbling blocks here and there. The first and most glaringly obvious is Section Hospital right at the start of the game. I've got no problems with levels that raise a ton of questions for the game to answer later on. Helps keep players engaged in the story, and all previous games of Metal Gear series have done this type of thing. Yet the Phantom Pain goes about this in a rather weird way. Sure, the little story beats we get are quite interesting. We get introduced to prominent characters in the story, Quiet, the Third Boy, and the Man on Fire, along with this rather enigmatic bandage guy called Ishmael. He's important later, trust me on that. And we get a rather good sense of mystery and intrigue. But then it all falls apart when you're tasked with controlling Snake. Because muscle atrophy is a thing, for most of the level you're forced to crawl through it at an agonizingly slow pace, while also hiding from guards at various points, because that's always fun. Even after Snake gets used for his legs back, you've still got a fair amount of level left to play through, including the somewhat annoying stealth section near the end, which is way more frustrating than it needs to be. At the end of the day, all this combines together to create a level which seems far longer than it actually is, and one that comes with quite a lot of needless padding from beginning to end. Especially how it takes you about 20 minutes before you can even start to control Snake. Even the final chase sequence where Snake and Ocelot escape on horseback from Man on Fire seems to be dragged out to some degree, and that's one of the few things I enjoyed. Maybe Kojima's finally lost its touch? We'll have to wait for Death Stranding to get an answer for that one. Technically this is cheating, but considering how the level before this one is so bloody short it can barely be called a level, I'm counting this one anyway. So, yeah, the number 5 spot goes to possibly the most infamous thing Naughty Dog has made since the Water Slums, the museum from Uncharted 2. Yeah, we have the usual tedium and bad pacing problems that I mentioned time and time again, etc. ad nauseum, but that's not the main point of discussion here. Our main issue here is that this chapter, I think it's called Breaking and Entering or something, not really that important, our main problem here is that this chapter is a stealth level in a game that's not really built for stealth. Sure, it's an interesting change of pace of the series, means you don't have to avoid lethal death trap to get our first MacGuffin, but maybe try a less irritating way to do it next time? It's incredibly easy to get spotted as well. The guards in this game do have flashlights. Trying to pinpoint their position and plan a route through this place isn't the easiest task in the world. The camera is your biggest enemy here. Guards will pop up from out of nowhere or behind you with little to no warning, simply because you couldn't see them. You do get a tranq pistol later on, which I guess is supposed to make things easier for you, although it really doesn't. Well, it does somewhat. It does knock out guards in a single shot, but it only holds one dart at a time, is incredibly slow to reload, and has piss poor range. And you're required to use it in some points to progress, so enjoy waiting around for that reload time. Thank God the rest of the game picks up the pace a bit. Oh, this is one I have quite a few grievances with. So, the Forsaken Fortress, everybody. Jeez, what is it with Zelda games with badly designed stealth sections? Ocarina of Time and Harrow Castle grounds, Skyward Sword had that bit in Elden Volcano, and the less said about Phantom Hourglass, the Temple of the Ocean King, the better. However, Wind Waker's first trip to the Forsaken Fortress is a gigantic pain in the backside. For a start, this place is massive, crawling with enemies, and you're completely defenseless, as you lose your sword, aka your only weapon, upon entering the place. And I just got that too. Tetra, you better reimburse me for the cost of that thing. That catapult was already to begin with. Well, technically you're not completely defenseless. You do get the opportunity to pick up and use enemy weapons at certain points, although you can't take them outside of the room you find them in, so honestly I don't really see the point in having them at all. Then again, the rest of the fortress isn't that much better. Avoiding the moblins that roam the halls is only the start of your troubles. They really like to stick together and patrol tight corridors, making sneaking past them more difficult than it needs to be. These little corridor runs are broken up with sections where you have to avoid searchlights, where it's really easy to get detected by someone you couldn't even see. While this entire level isn't that much different from our previous entry, it edges out due to being a great deal longer. Sure, the stealth bits of the museum are bad enough, but at least that's over and done with rather quickly in comparison. Here, not only is there more to get through, but once you're spotted, instead of reloading your last checkpoint, you're thrown into a cell at the back of the fortress, forcing you to get all the way back to where you were before having another go, and depending on where you were, that's quite the large amount of fortress. The Gen 7 Pokemon games are probably some of my favourite in the series, especially when it comes to designing the region. Alola is vibrant and colourful, most of the landmarks are a feast for the eyes, and this region has possibly the strongest lineup of new Pokemon yet. However, for all of Gen 7's successes, I can't overlook some of the more glaring design flaws. For example, dedicating an entire island to about 75% tutorials wasn't the smartest idea if you ask me. Now, look, I get it. Sun and Moon did quite a few things differently from the series, and for a long-running series like Pokemon, which hasn't really changed structure that much in the 20 years it's been around, you need a way to teach both first-time players and series veterans how this new system works. For a start, there's no gym leaders and their replacements are way different. However, I think they chose the worst way to do it. You're constantly bombarded with exposition and story from the moment you boot it up, most of which is honestly filler. You don't even get to pick your starter until about 20 minutes, and even once you get on that road, you don't get very far until you're stopped and forced to deal with another bit of filler, and this pattern unfortunately continues all the way to the first trial. Now, Pokemon's always been quite a linear series of RPGs, but the railroading was never been quite as egregious as it is here. For a start, the trainer school section doesn't even need to be here, and was there any reason to place the first Pokemon Center in its mandatory tutorial after the first major town you visit? And for the love of God, can you finally give us the option to skip the bloody Pokemon catching tutorial? It's been 20 years, guys. I think long-term players have figured out the finer details of that by now. No? Fine. Show of hands. Am I predictable? Because I'm pretty certain a lot of you could see this coming from about a mile away. Yes, I know I'm picking the low-hanging fruit for my penultimate entry, but the Roxas prologue from Kingdom Hearts 2 has definitely earned its place on this list. Now, I've got no problem with having us play as different characters during a prologue chapter, tons of other games do it all the time. Plus, Roxas is quite important to the plot of Kingdom Hearts, introducing him this way allows the game to help set up important plot points later down the line. My problem here is that while most games keep these chapters short and sweet, Kingdom Hearts 2 decides to make us trudge through about 3 hours worth of this. Now, I'd be fine with this if it wasn't 3 hours of absolutely nothing. Apart from a few chance encounters with some basic nobody enemies and a final confrontation with Axel, which is admittedly pretty fun, hardly anything of note happens here, and it just drags on and on. We get some really cryptic story beats that won't be explained for about 10 more hours, and the rest is just inconsequential bullshit. A borderline pointless struggle tournament that just screams filler, a couple of weird search sections that don't really serve any purpose, and this annoying section we have to grind for about 20 minutes in order to get an absurd amount of cash, only have it stolen immediately after, making what we did completely worthless. That's essentially what the majority of this prologue is. Worthless. More than half of it can be cut out while hardly affecting the rest of the game, and even the stuff that's important could do with picking up the pace a bit. I suppose the only really saving grace about this whole thing is that Square Enix have seemingly learned their lesson from this, and as the prologues to the next few games in the series are miles better by comparison. So, yeah, this is another incredibly predictable one. If it wasn't this, then what could it be? And of all the potential candidates I could have chosen, I can't think of a more worthy choice than the tutorial level of Driver. Where do I start with this? I suppose the only appropriate phrase to describe this bit is train wreck. From a story standpoint, this whole scenario makes sense, I guess. You're a getaway driver, recently recruited by a criminal gang, and need to prove your skills. Yet I can think of about a million better ways of going about it. You're essentially just thrown into the game and given a list of complex driving maneuvers to complete, except you're not told what any of these are, no knowledge of the controls, and you've only got 60 seconds, so get a move on. Oh, and be careful because hitting a total of 4 things causes you to instantly fail and you're forced to try again. Which is a lot worse than it sounds because this level is extremely cramped. What kind of building are we anyway? My local petrol station has more parking spaces. At first, you think you can do it. After attempt number 5, you vow to stick with it. After attempt 10, frustration sinks in, and after attempt 20, you start questioning what the point is. You start questioning whether this is real life or if it's just fantasy. Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Sticking the hardest part of your game right at the start is one thing, but throwing you into the deep end with no knowledge about anything at all is another. When you've got people making strategy guides and in-depth walkthroughs on how to complete a fucking tutorial, then something has gone terribly wrong with your fundamental game design. This has been the Cyber Engineer, and days where you can stick a Queen reference into a script are honestly the best types of days. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.